based on everything I have seen, that the likeliest situation here was that the Chinese were messing around with the virus, somebody caught it in a lab, and they took this novel virus and spread it through China and then spread it to the world. And I was personally very upset because we had a conversation with President Zelensky. We want to be in a joint venture with you, not because we're trying to steal from your country, but because we think that's actually a security guarantee. If we're your partner in an important economic endeavor, and he said, sure, we want to do this deal. It makes all the sense in the world. I read 2 days later that Zelensky's out there saying, I rejected the deal. I told him, no way, that we're not doing that. Well, that's not what happened in that meeting. So you start to get upset by somebody. We're trying to help these guys.
As Secretary of State, what is your position on China?
Well, it's not my position. It'll be the Trump position on it. And I think the President Trump's position is pretty straightforward. On the one hand, just like Russia, China's a global power. The second largest economy in the world, rapidly growing military. We have to have relations with the Chinese. We have to. Whether we agree with everything they do, we understand that in some cases we're competitors and others we're direct adversaries. But there has to be communication because the lack of communication could lead to conflict.
If I can just jump in, what I'm hearing you say is that in the last 4 years, there's been a breakdown in communication with China and also Russia.
Well, interestingly enough, the communication with China has actually been better than the communication with the Russians under the Biden administration and to the current day, which is why there has to be some level of maturity here and practicality and pragmatism when it comes to foreign policy. That said, we're not going to live in a world where we depend on China for critical rare earth minerals, for critical components in our supply chain. We're not going to live in a world in which China gets to dominate the Indo-Pacific, and we're not allowed to have commercial ties in that region because they're holding countries hostage, and they all become tributary states. The Japanese have no interest in being a tributary state, and they're close allies of ours. The South Koreans, the Philippines, Australia. None of these countries want to become tributary states. Vietnam, for that matter, are not interested in becoming sort of tributary states in a Chinese zone of influence. We are a Pacific nation. We intend to remain one and maintain our relationships there. So that is a red line for us. We're not going to abandon our engagement as a Pacific power. And by the other token, we're not going to live in a world where the Chinese dominate things that are critical to our economy and be held hostage by them. That's just silly to do it. Some of that involves improving our domestic industrial capability. Some of that involves partnering with allied nations to secure our supply chains. And the third point I would make is we have to deal with this unfairness. Chinese companies can do virtually anything they want in the American economy for many, many years. We allowed them to do anything they wanted in America, but American companies can virtually do nothing inside of China. And if they do, it's because they want to steal your intellectual property and then put you out of business and replace you with a Chinese company. That's why the president's always talking about reciprocity. Whatever we are allowed to do there is what they should be allowed to do here. Whatever they charge us on tariffs is what we should be charging them. And that's what the president's bringing, not just to China, but to the world, is reciprocity and fairness.
You have access as a senator to high-level intelligence. You have more access now that you are Secretary of State. Does the intelligence leave no doubt that COVID-19 came from the lab in Wuhan, China?
Well, I wouldn't say that it leaves no doubt. I would say, and I've long believed this, and I've said this irrespective, just common sense tells you, that the chances that this was and I say an accident. We know that the Chinese spent years, in some cases with Western funding, taking viruses and re-engineering these viruses, trying to predict what if this virus carried over into humans, what would it look like? And they were probably doing it because they were trying to come up with a vaccine for it. Let's say somebody got infected, messing around with that in a lab. They went out into Wuhan, they gave it to 10 people, those 10 people spread it to the world. I think the evidence is compelling that that's exactly what happened here. And I put out a report as a senator that detailed all kinds of circumstantial evidence that proved that as well. So I think, in my view, based on everything I have seen, that the likeliest situation here was that the Chinese were messing around with the virus, somebody caught it in a lab, and they took this novel virus and spread it through China and then spread it to the world. And it was devastating. And there needs to be accountability for that.
I was just going to say, there really has been no accountability for the CCP.
The accountability begins by proving it. And it's hard to do, right? Because the Chinese are not necessarily going to open their books. Look, if that had happened in the United States, if that had happened in some other country in the world, that country would have probably been forthcoming and said, we had a problem, guys, we were messing around with this stuff, and look what happened. They would have shared that information, and we could have worked very quickly, much faster than we were able to figure out how to counteract it. And they didn't. Instead, what they did is clam up and refuse to share information with the world, and then this thing spread and just ravaged the global economy. Just think about how many people died, how many businesses went out, how much money we had to spend in this country just to keep Main Street open when we had the shutdowns, how divisive it became. Some of that could have been prevented if they had been forthcoming. But instead, like most authoritarian regimes, they clammed up and they held that information back. So I think we have to do two things. We have to, if we can prove that this is what happened, and I think the day will come when we might be able to prove it. We need to show that to the world. But we also have to make sure this never happens again. Because if they were doing that, we have to assume they're still doing that. And we have to assume that they're still doing that and that this could happen again. And it could be even more devastating than COVID, as hard as that is to believe. We can't let that happen. And I think, by the way, a lot of countries in the world suspect this too. They may have the guts to say it, they may not want to stand up to it, they may not want to have to take on the wrath of China because they don't have our standing and our stature. But I think a lot of countries in the world suspect that that's what happened here as well. But we're the United States, and if we can prove it, we need to. And at least put the evidence out there that this is what's indicated.
Will the U.S. defend Taiwan if China moves against the island?
Let me just say that I think our commitments to Taiwan have been clear, and they've been expressed through multiple administrations for multiple years. We are against any sort of compelled, forced change of status. That's been our policy. That remains our policy. We're not seeking to trigger a conflict. We don't want to see a conflict, but we have made very clear through years and years of our policies, the 6 assurances, the Taiwan Relations Act, that we are against any sort of change in status by force or by threat or by coercion, and that remains our policy. And that's generally how we've left it, and that's what's provided stability, and I hope it continues to provide stability. Whether the Chinese and President Xi shares that view, I think there's real doubts about it. But we're not going to walk away from, for example, supporting Taiwan being involved in international forums where their views and their interests are not represented by the mainland at this point. So we're going to keep all the commitments we've made, but the most important one is to make clear that we are against and oppose any sort of forced change in status.
You told reporters in Saudi Arabia that there hasn't been regularized contact with the Russians in 3.5 years. How much ground was lost under the Biden White House?
Well, there was no ground. I mean, it was all lost. We had no. There are 3 things that people have to understand. The first is, even at the height of the Cold War, even in the worst days of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had communication. And the reason why, if you want to be mature and grown-ups about it, I'm not a fan of most of what Vladimir Putin has done, and that's largely irrelevant when it comes to statecraft, because we ultimately have to be able to talk to a nation that has, in some cases, the largest tactical nuclear weapon stockpile in the world, and the second largest, if not the largest, strategic nuclear weapon stockpile in the world. So you have to have, I mean, at the end, whether we like it or not, Russia is a power, a global power, and they're involved and engaged in Syria. They've been involved and engaged in the Middle East, even in the Western Hemisphere, certainly in Europe. We have to have some communication with them. So step 1 is our embassy in Moscow is barely functioning. I mean, it literally barely operates because it's been denied access to the banking system. That has to be fixed. If we close our mission in Russia, we have to close their mission here. And then we really have no communication with them, whether it's a detained American or some other item. The second is, the president's been very clear. He wants this war with Ukraine to end. And he wants to know, are the Russians serious about ending the war or not serious about ending the war? The only way is to test them, to basically engage them and say, okay, are you serious about ending the war? And if so, what are your demands? Are your public demands and your private demands different? We have to have some process by which we engage in that conversation. Now, it may turn out that they don't want to end the war. I don't know. We're going to find out. But we have to have that process to determine that. And so our meeting was really a follow-up to President Trump's conversation with Putin. It's unfortunate that some of this hyperbole and some of this hysteria, because he talked to him on the phone, has clouded some of the rationale behind this. At the end of the day, we have to have relations with Russia, whether we like everything they're doing or not, because we did with the Soviet Union, and we have to be able to test and see if they're serious about ending this war.
In your meetings, did the Russian foreign minister make clear that there can be no end to the war if Ukraine joins NATO?
There was no discussions about any details. Now, the Russians have their own readout of what happened, but I can tell you we did not negotiate any fine points about any deal. The course of that conversation was as follows. Number 1, we have to some level of regularization just of our diplomatic missions, because we have to be able to communicate with them, given the nature of our 2 countries and the importance that we have in the world. The second is, there are things we could cooperate on geopolitically, potentially. I mean, there are items of the world where I think we have a common interest. I'm not sure the Russians are fans of the Iranian regime having nuclear weapons, as an example, and so forth. But we can't work on those things. We're going to disagree on a lot, but we can't work on the things we might potentially agree on or deconflict on things that could lead to dangerous confrontations. as long as this Ukraine impediment stands in the way. And so really, as much as anything else, this meeting was, are you interested in even talking about ending the war? If you are, then let's create a process where we can begin to engage at a technical level. And that process will now at some point be set up and begin. I also think, by the way, it's unfair to say that we didn't consult anybody on it.
I was just going to ask you.
About that.
Ukraine was not at the talks. Are you consulting with President Zelensky about his red lines?
Well, just in the last week, President Zelensky has met with the Secretary of the Treasury, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, bipartisan delegations in the U.S. Senate and House that were also in Munich. Our special envoy is there today, meeting with him. So we talked to the Ukrainians throughout this process, and we explained to them very clearly what our intentions were in terms of pursuing this. In fact, the President of the United States spoke to Zelensky right after he hung up with Putin. I was in the office for both phone calls. So to say that we haven't consulted with them is not accurate. It's not true. It's also not true that we haven't consulted with our allies in Europe. I personally spoke to the 5 foreign ministers right after my meeting with the Russians and walked them through what had happened. We talked to them before those meetings, the same 5, plus the G7, plus the EU, and all the other meetings we had in Munich. So this is just not accurate. But that was a meeting to largely determine whether they were interested or not in finding a way to end this war. And
are they interested?
We're going to find out. I mean, I tell people peace is it's an action. It's not a noun, it's a verb. It's an action. You have to actually pursue it. So at the end of the day, they're either interested or they're not. If the demands they make for ending the war are maximalist and unrealistic, then I think we have our answer. If, on the other hand, there's any opportunity to pursue peace, we have to do it. And I think people have, I really am sort of puzzled, generally, in diplomacy, people who are seeking to end the killing and the harming of thousands and thousands of people in war are usually celebrated for an effort to end the war. If it was just the Vatican who was involved in these talks, who would criticize it? For the President of the United States to be engaged in finding whether there's the possibility of peace should be celebrated, not condemned. But anyway, that's the kind of the world we live in right now.
Did the U.S. delegation make clear to the Russians that there are no guarantees about the retention of territory they have annexed from Ukraine?
We didn't engage in any specifics about territories, none of these, because that wasn't the purpose of that meeting. The purpose of the meeting was to determine whether there was a real interest in discussing peace or not. If there is, then a process like that can begin. And I also think it's silly to say, well, the Ukrainians are going to be cut out or the Europeans are going to be cut out. You can't. You can't find a stop to a war unless both of sides and their views are represented. They both have to agree to it. Like, Russia can't agree to a ceasefire or to an end of hostilities if the Ukrainians don't agree to it. It has to be on terms acceptable to both sides. Likewise with the Europeans. The Europeans and the EU have their own set of sanctions on Russia. Even if we lifted all of our sanctions, which none of that was discussed, the Europeans would have to lift sanctions too in order for something to be possible. So they'll all have to be consulted at some point, but we're just not at that stage yet.
So what's the signal, Secretary Rubio, that the Russians are serious about peace?
Well, the signal, well, I can't answer whether they're serious about peace or not yet. That will have to be determined by the attitude they take moving forward. The only thing we agreed upon is that we're going to talk about peace. What they offer, what they're willing to concede to, what they're willing to consider, will determine whether they're serious about peace or not. We're just not at that stage yet.
When President Trump posts that President Zelensky is a dictator without elections, what are you thinking?
I think President Trump is very upset at President Zelensky, and in some cases, and rightfully so. Look, number one, Joe Biden had frustrations with Zelensky. People shouldn't forget it. There are newspaper articles out there about how he cursed at him in a phone call because Zelensky, instead of saying thank you for all your help, is immediately out there messaging what we're not doing or what he's not getting. I think the second thing is, frankly, I was personally very upset because we had a conversation with President Zelensky, the Vice President and I, the three of us. And we discussed this issue about the mineral rights. And we explained to them, look, we want to be in a joint venture with you, not because we're trying to steal from your country, but because we think that's actually a security guarantee. If we're your partner in an important economic endeavor, we get to get paid back some of the money the taxpayers have given, close to $200 billion. And it also, now we have a vested interest in the security of Ukraine. And he said, sure, we want to do this deal. It makes all the sense in the world. The only thing is I need to run it through my legislative process. They have to approve it. I read 2 days later that Zelensky's out there saying, I rejected the deal. I told him no way that we're not doing that. Well, that's not what happened in that meeting. So you start to get upset by somebody. We're trying to help these guys. One of the points the president made in his messaging is not that we don't care about Ukraine, but Ukraine is on another continent. You know, it doesn't directly impact the daily lives of Americans. We care about it because it has implications for our allies and ultimately for the world. There should be some level of gratitude here about this. And when you don't see it and you see him out there accusing the president of living in a world of disinformation, that's very counterproductive. And I don't need to explain to you or anybody else, President Trump's not the kind of person that's going to sit there and take that. He's very transparent. He's going to tell you exactly how he feels. And he sent a message that he's not going to get gamed here. He's willing to work on peace because he cares about Ukraine. And he hopes Zelensky will be a partner in that, and not someone who's out there putting this sort of counter messaging to try to, hustle us in that regard. That's not going to be productive here.
What's the timeline for a meeting between President Trump and President Putin?
Well, that topic came up in our conversation with the Russians, and what I said, I know that now they're saying that they said it, but we actually said it, and that is, well, there isn't going to be a meeting until we know what the meeting's going to be about. I mean,
do you expect it later in 2025?
I don't know the timing of it, but a meeting between President Putin and President Trump has to a meeting about something. We have to know what that meeting is about, what's going to be achieved at it. You don't generally have these meetings until you know some outcome or some progress has been made. So I think when that meeting happens will largely depend on whether we can make any progress on ending the war in Ukraine. And if we can, and that meeting is what seals the deal, I think everybody should celebrate that President Trump is a peacemaker. He's the only global leader right now that can make this happen. The only global leader.
Why do you say he's the only one?
Well, because others have tried and have failed. There was an effort in Istanbul a couple years ago, and it involved a number of European countries, and it failed. It didn't lead to a result. No, this war is now going on its third year. What global leader now could engage in this and actually even bring Putin to the table? Maybe we're not successful either, but right now we're the only ones that, through President Trump, that have any chance. Maybe the chance is 1%, I don't know. Maybe the chance is 90%. But he's the only one that can even test that proposition. And everyone should recognize that and celebrate the fact that he's willing to do that early in his presidency. He's willing to do it. No one else is willing to do it, and no one else right now apparently can.
Do you have any regrets about the shuttering of USAID?
No, it's not regret. Look, I wish we'd had more cooperation. I know people at USAID don't like to hear that, but it's the truth. And I'm going to go back to my time in Congress. Okay, I've had two problems with AID going back to my time in Congress. I'm not against foreign aid. I've supported foreign aid. We're going to do foreign aid. No one here is saying we're going to have
so
a
some
zero.
Programs will survive.
Absolutely, and some already have. We've issued waivers for PEPFAR as an example, and others. That's not the question. The question is, no one can tell me every program is valuable and needs to be kept. Some, frankly, shouldn't have ever existed. In many other cases, you have programs where the program is titled something, and then you realize the program's not run by USAID. The USAID simply provides grants or money to a company or to an entity, an NGO, whatever, and they're out there running the program. And as a member of Congress, when you wanted to ask, well, who is operating this program? Because sometimes it goes from a program and then they give it to a third person, that third person.
Sounds like a shell game.
It can be, and so that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of. So ideally, you would have people open up the books and say, well, here's who our contractors are, and here's what they work on, and here's why it's mission critical. And we didn't find a lot of cooperation in that regard. And so the result was, and this was before I became acting, but even after, some of those people that became uncooperative, in some cases were even trying to push payments through the system to get around the freeze. That we have to address. And so I think it's unfortunate because the ideal way would have been, but this, to go through it the way I've just described, but this is an agency, frankly, at least at some levels, that has been largely uncooperative and completely unaligned with the State Department. We have embassies where USAID and the embassy work very well together. And we have embassies where the embassy is working on one mission and USAID is working on a completely different mission that's in contradiction with what the State Department's directive is in that nation. That has to be fixed. So ideally, we would have fixed it in a way that would have been, different. But when you run into passive-aggressive and in some cases aggressive opposition to your work, that requires you to now go in and put a stop to everything. And so that's the process we've had to follow, unfortunately, but that's the only way we're going to get to the bottom of this. We have to answer, this is American taxpayer money. The idea that USAID is some sort of global charity that's out there, serving the interest of the global community. No, it's called the USAID. In the United States, it's our taxpayer money. That should also be aligned with the national interest. And if it isn't, it needs to stop.
As we sit down today, Hamas has released the bodies of 4 Israeli hostages, said to include a mother and 2 children. Your thoughts?
I think it's a reminder of who Hamas really is. I mean, just think about the fact they went in, they grabbed this family, this young woman, her 2 infant children. I think one was only 4 years old, the other one was 1. And then, and it's not just that they did it and that they died in their captivity. Who does that? I mean, who kidnaps families? And then the way even that they were released, with people cheering in the streets, it just tells you who we're dealing with Hamas. This is not a government. This is not simply an ideological movement. These are evil, terrible people. And the idea that they would ever be allowed to continue to have arms, to be militarized, and to control territory anywhere in the world is unfathomable. So our hearts break for these families. You can't be happy that remains are returned, but that's very important to these families. From a religious standpoint, it's a sacred thing. But I think to everybody else, it's a reminder as well of who we're talking about here when we talk about Hamas.
One of the Israeli government's objectives is the destruction of Hamas. You see some of these pictures, they suggest some strength. What does the intelligence tell us?
Well, I would never discuss intelligence, but I can tell you Hamas is weaker than they once were. They clearly have enough people to put on these shows. They clearly have enough people to still be a threat at some level, but they can't be allowed to reconstitute. Hamas cannot be allowed to once again be a group that can do three things: terrorize the people of Gaza, attack Israel, and actually be a government or anything like a government anywhere in the world. They just can't be as long as Hamas is in Gaza, there will never be peace in Gaza, because they are going to go back to attacking Israel, and Israel is going to have to respond. And I just ask everybody, if a group like that was operating on the other side of our border with Canada or Mexico, constantly launching attacks. If a group existed in Mexico that came across our border, kidnapped Americans, babies, and launched rockets, we would eliminate them. We would wipe them out. And no country in the world can coexist alongside a group whose intended purpose is the destruction of your state and is willing to commit atrocities like this in the pursuance of it. So I think it's in the best interest of everyone, including Palestinians, to get rid of Hamas, because Hamas terrorizes them too. They hide behind these people.
What is the plan for Gaza?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the president's plan is the only one that's out there right now. And what the president's point is, how are you going to rebuild this place when you have people living among the rubble? How are you going to rebuild it as long as a group like Hamas is operating there? You can't. If Hamas is there, Israel's going to go after them. So he's put out his plan. And his view of it is you got to remove people from the area so you can actually do the construction. Now, our partners in the region don't like that plan. And I talked to them. I've talked to the Egyptians. I've talked to the Jordanians. They came here a week ago. Talked to the Saudis. I talked to the UAE yesterday. And my challenge is, if you don't like the president's plan, then I think you should come up with a better plan. And I hope they do. I hope they come up with a plan that allows for the reconstruction of Gaza. The United States will try to help it, or will help, as will others, including countries in the region that have to take ownership. But look, the job of removing rubble, the job of rebuilding housing, that can be done. And finding the money to pay for it. The countries in that region are very rich. They can help do that as well. I think the fundamental challenge in any plan is, who is going to govern Gaza? What organization, because it can't be Hamas, and how are you going to get rid of them? Because ultimately someone is going to have to go in and get rid of Hamas.